Hi, I'm Olson. I'm going to interviewing my uncle Mark Sigstad.
Hi, I'm Mark Sigstad. I and my wife and our family were missionaries in West Africa for over 35 years. And so Edie is going to be asking me some questions about my life and our ministry in Africa. So, Edie, what's the first question you have for me?
How did you feel the call to go to Africa?
Well, I was in a local church, and through the preaching, I got saved. And then we had a missions conference, and I heard a missionary preach in that conference. And I don't remember his name. I don't remember what actually he preached. But during the invitation, that man in 1975, that man said, after he preached, he said, God is looking for some men who are willing to go to Africa. He didn't say we were called. He just said, would you be willing to go? And in that service, my wife Linda and I went forward, and I told my pastor that I would be willing to go to West Africa. And that's actually how I started. And of course, my pastor said you need to go to Bible college to finish up, your education. And then when I finished Bible college, I still didn't really have a specific place to go. But I felt, because the missionary had talked about willing to go to Africa, and I had started out like that. So what I did is I called BIMI, Baptist International Missions Incorporated, and I spoke with the man who was in charge of the missionaries going to Africa. And I asked him if he had a missionary that was willing to go anywhere in Africa, where would you send him? And that man gave me five, and I said, give me 5 reasons. He gave me 5 specific reasons why, if he had somebody that he could send, he would send them to Nigeria. And so that's how Linda and I and our family ended up in Nigeria.
And then, how old were you both when this happened?
Well, we were in our probably in our mid 20s at that time. Linda and I got married in 1972. So 75 would have put it, another 4 years or 3 years after that. We were married at 21, so that would put us about 25, a couple of years for Bible college. So when we went to the mission field, we were right at 30 years old.
And then, do you remember the 5 reasons?
Well, I don't remember them all, but I remember the man said, I was talking to a BIMI man. So he said BIMI doesn't have anyone in Nigeria at the time. He said the second reason was Nigeria is the largest black nation on the face of the earth. More black people are in Nigeria than anywhere else. Third reason was that the doors were open at that time. The government was allowing missionaries to come in. The fourth reason was that it was an English-speaking country. Now, there are many languages, but the national language was English. So he said you can get off the airplane and begin preaching and teaching. That's a benefit. I don't remember what the 5th reason was, but those were the 4 of the 5 reasons.
Okay, and then can you tell me about your training for the mission field?
Okay, your training for the mission field, I look at as 2 different things, a twofold thing. One is what I call formal training, and then the second is what I call practical training. So the formal training, I had already graduated from the University of Minnesota before I got saved, but I needed Bible college, and I didn't need to take any of the other courses other than just the Bible courses. So I went to Bible college basically just to get a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in Bible and theology and evangelism, the things that I needed to be able to take the Bible and teach and preach it. The practical part of the training is literally local church. So I was in a local church. I worked in a local church as a youth pastor, as an assistant superintendent of Sunday schools, as a superintendent of Sunday schools. I worked in VBS. I worked in the bus ministry, soul winning. All the different ministries that you would have in a local church in America, you're going to have in Africa. And because I was going to be the pastor, I'm going to have to lead these programs. So the formal training, I graduated from Hyles-Anderson College, and I have a couple of other degrees from other colleges. And then I had the practical training, from being in 2 different local churches. I was only in 2 churches before I went to the mission field. the church where I got saved at in Minnesota. Ron Royalty was the pastor at Oakland Baptist Church, and then First Baptist Church where I got my formal training. And then, the practical training under Ron Royalty and under Dr. Jack Hiles. And so when I went to Africa, I was well suited to be able to start a church ministry.
And then did you and your wife have to go through Bible college, or was it just you?
Well, just me, because again, we did not. I didn't get saved until after we were married, and we didn't really have a plan as far as going to the mission field, right out of Bible college, because when I got saved, I was married, we had children, and so when we basically surrendered to be missionaries. Linda was already a housewife. She had a job. So basically, her on-the-job training was basically being a housewife and a mother. And so when we went to Africa, of course, she taught Sunday school. She was in the foster club at First Baptist Church, so she, had the good background in soul winning. Taught Sunday school, ran the choir, did basically everything. But when we were at college, she did take some classes, but she didn't graduate.
And then can you tell me about your first church and ministry?
Okay, now I was going to ask you about that. Are you talking about the church in Africa that we started, or the very first church I was ever in America?
Let's do the first church that you started.
Okay, the first church we started in Africa was in the city of Ibadan, and we started that from scratch. All of the churches we've started from scratch. And the way I started church, what I was taught was basically we spent 6 weeks soul winning. We first got a building, got everything set up, and then spent 6 weeks soul winning with the goal that at the end of that 6 weeks we would start a church. So we went out and started, everything, doing, knocking doors, going into markets and doing things like that. And then we started the church, and I have a philosophy that there's sometimes people believe you start, you start the church and then, with Sunday morning service, and then, a couple weeks later you start, Sunday night service, and a couple weeks after that. But when we started the church, we started every ministry at the same time. So that first Sunday, we had Sunday school, we had Sunday morning, we had Sunday night church service, and in the announcements, we announced that on Wednesday we're having our Wednesday Bible study. We announced that Saturday was our soul winning time. We announced when we were going to start a choir. All the different things that we did. So the first church in Ibadan, and that's what we called it our main church, and we built that up to over the course of time to several hundred people before we started another church.
And then, when did you go to Africa?
Linda and I went to Africa in 1984, January 10th. And we remember that day because there had been a military coup. So there was no government when we landed. And it was a very interesting, flying to one airport, and that airport was closed. So we had to fly to another airport. And then, the people were waiting for us at the wrong airport. And it was kind of, very confusing when we first landed. But those are the things that can discourage a missionary. But if you know that this is where God wants you, you work through it.
And also, how did you guys feel when you landed there? Were you nervous, excited?
Well, it kind of everything combined. It's brand new. So there's maybe a little bit of apprehension because you don't know. When you have a family, going into that situation as a husband and as a like a mother, Linda and I, there was a little bit of apprehension. Okay, we're taking our children into this. What are we getting into? There's government regulations that you have to follow. You don't know how the people are going to react to preaching. And one of the things we found is Nigeria they're very friendly people, very open. And it was very easy because of the English language was there. We didn't have to learn a separate language to start with. So it made it a lot easier for us to adjust. And there is an adjustment. It's like going from, let's say northern Minnesota where it's cold in the wintertime to Florida where it's warm. No snow, it's always hot. So there's an adjustment as far as how the temperature. There's an adjustment on the food you eat. So it was, and the kids were a little apprehensive too. But children adjust faster than the older people. It's much easier for them. So sometimes we kind of had to lean on them.
Okay. And then, where have you served?
Well, I have basically been in 3 countries in Africa. Very early on in our ministry, Nigeria is our main setup. And then after several years, many years, we had one of our young men who was a preacher boy, and he was called to go to Ghana. So I went with him, or Linda and I went with him and started the church in Ghana. And then early in our ministry, I went to the country of Zaire. At the time, it's called the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is in the central part. The map here has got it. The central part right there. And I helped an older missionary, and we opened a medical clinic in the bush, or what they would call the jungle, but it's called the bush there. And so I've been in 3 different places. When I was in the Congo, basically the emphasis was on the medical part, but we had a church there, and I preached every week. Did a lot of different ministries there, of course, soul winning. But it was more difficult there because their language is the main language is French, and then once you get out of the capital city, they don't even speak French. They're speaking the native languages, Kikongo, Lingala, but then in Ghana and Nigeria, we've started churches and Bible institutes and different ministries that are attached to the local church.
And then how many churches did you plant while in Africa?
Well, we've over the course of our 35 years, we started 12 churches. Now, each of those churches today is pastored by a Nigerian man. We started a Bible institute in the country of Nigeria first, and we trained our national pastors, or our men who wanted to become pastors. We trained them in our Bible Institute, and then as we started the churches, we took those men and they were made the pastors of those churches. And so those churches are what we call indigenous churches now, where we've started the churches and now they have their own budgets. They take care of their own finances. They support their own missionaries. But all the money that for running the church comes from that local church.
Okay, and then how has Africa changed since going?
Well, Africa's changed. There's a lot of, of course, they've been modernized. It's, when we first went out there, of course, it's a long time ago. Today everybody's got cell phones and but when we first went to Africa, there were, the roads were very poor. There was no phone. There were no phones at all. No communication with America other than writing letters and sending letters. And if we had an emergency, we could. There was a phone. There was a phone distribution center in downtown Ibadan where we would go down there, give them the number, and they would call America, and then we went to a phone booth and answered the phone there. So they have modernized as far as society. In some parts, they have not progressed quickly because the government doesn't spend money on what we call infrastructure. Infrastructure is like your electricity, your roads, the running water, telephone systems, things like that. So when we first went out there, we didn't have landline telephones, which is the wires. We had electricity, we had some running water, pipe-borne water, and the roads were average, especially between cities. Sometimes in the cities they were not really good. But over the course of 35 years, the government has not spent a lot of money, so instead of advancing in the quality of their infrastructure, they still suffer. So if you go to Nigeria today, people have generators because the power does not come on very often. People either drill a hole in their yard, which is for water, a borehole, or they go down, and have water, brought to their house, or they dig a well, because the city or the government does not have any water. There's no pipe-borne water. And you take a city about the size of Chicago, there's no water. There's no, water to flush your toilets. There's no water to wash your clothes. There's no water to take a bath unless now when we were there, we had pipe-borne water for the first 5 or 6 years, regular. But then that quit, so then we went down to the river and hired a tanker truck, and they would come to our house, and we used gravity. We had a 400-gallon water tank above the roof of the house, and so that tanker truck would pump water to that, and then we had we could actually take 2,000 gallons of water on our property. And when that tanker truck came, he filled the top one, filled the bottom tanks we had, and that gave us the water. So when you came into our house, it was like a modern house. I mean, we had toilets, we had sinks, all of that. And when you turned the tap, it was there, but that water was not from the city. It was from the river that we paid a tanker truck to bring to us. Now, people are still doing that. So, the people have progressed, but the way things are in Africa, at least in Nigeria and Ghana, have not progressed the infrastructure. Now, in Ghana, the infrastructure is much better than Nigeria, but that's, again, Ghana has, I don't know if it's the government that has done a better job, but when you go to those two countries, basically they're the same people, some of them from the same tribes, but the government money and how they fund things. You go and you can go to modern markets, but you also have the markets that are what we would call like bush markets, where they're selling things in the open. Linda would go to the market sometimes, like on Tuesday morning, she'd go to the markets and they have slaughtered a cow. And, it's not refrigerated. They slaughter the cow, and you pick the meat that you want, and they wrap it up and bring it to the house. So it's different than here in America. But, you learn that this is Africa, and this is the way things are done.
Okay. And can you tell me about your deputation?
Okay, deputation. Now, sometimes people don't know what deputation is, but deputation is the process where a missionary raises money, and the missionary needs to raise money for two different things. One is for living. In other words, he's got to rent a house, he's got to buy food, got to educate his children. The other thing the missionary needs is money for his ministry. He's going to have to rent another building for a church. He's going to have to pay electricity for that church. He's going to have to, buy chairs and build a pulpit and do things that you have for the ministry. Most countries around the world, they will not allow a missionary to come in and work a job. So deputation is where the missionary raises the funds for family and ministry. And when I did deputation, now again, I want to tell you about deputation, in 1982. Which is different than it is today, because today there's so much technology in America. But when I did deputation, I went down to the Lake County Library and got telephone books, yellow pages, from different cities around America. Okay, I'm going to drive to Cincinnati. Where are the churches in Cincinnati that are independent Baptist churches like Faith and Practice? And I got those telephone numbers, and then I went home and I called those churches and tried to talk to the pastor to see if we could come and present our, now deputation normally is called deputation for the first time when you go out. So we haven't been to the field yet, so I want to get into the church and tell the pastor what my vision is, what I desire to do in Africa. And so our mission set an amount of money that they felt would be adequate for our family and our ministry. And so we traveled, Linda and I and our family traveled for 18 months, church to church, full-time, going sometimes church on Sunday morning, church on Sunday night, church on Wednesday night. Sometimes we would be in one church on Sunday, both services. Sometimes we were in a conference that started on Sunday and went through Wednesday. Sometimes we started in a conference that went from Wednesday to Sunday. But our goal was to present the work. And have those churches then take us on for support. And back then, we didn't need as much money for support as we do, as missionaries do today, simply because it costs more money to live today. And when we get to tough time and the blessing, I know you're going to ask a question about that. I will tell you a story on how God, a real blessing for us, in how God managed our money, because we didn't have a lot of money. We didn't need a lot of money. We had 6 children, but I felt we didn't need a lot of money because we were in Africa and they did not have a lot of money. But I needed money to live and money for ministry. So for us, it took 18 months. And then after 18 months, I literally quit. I was tired of going to churches. I wanted to get to Africa, so we left. Today, when I talk to missionaries, I tell them, raise all the money you're going to need, because you need money. You don't want to shortchange your ministry, and you need the money so that your family can live adequately. And I'm not saying, I won't even say comfortably. You got to have adequate things. In America, sometimes we think when someone says comfortably, you think you've got a real big fancy car and you've got fancy houses and all that. Adequate in Africa, today I would say you need a generator, because it's very difficult to sleep when it's 100 degrees outside. And if you don't have electricity inside, you don't even have a fan turning, and you don't sleep well. It's hot. Make sure you've got good running water for your the mom of the house. The kids can take showers, take bath, whatever. But I tell missionaries, don't shortchange deputation, because you can be a blessing to churches where you can encourage people to step out by faith, but also you want to take enough time so that God provides the things you need, because that's a faith-building exercise for you. In other words, you get to see in America how God can take care of you here. And Linda and I already knew that God could take care of us through a lot of different things in our life. And so, we didn't necessarily need the deputation to learn that. We needed deputation to be able to garner the funds we needed so that we could have the type of ministry that we wanted.
And then can you tell me about the story that you...
Oh, okay. Well, when we went to Nigeria, I didn't have a lot of money. Now, again, you have to understand how things are done. This is where you have to understand how they do things in their country. Now, in America, when you rent a house, you find a landlord or a realtor, and you pay a security deposit. Let's say you're going to rent an apartment. You pay like 1 month security deposit, and then you pay your first month rent. And so let's for adding purposes very quickly, let's say the monthly rent is $500. So you give a security deposit, let's say of $500, and then you give them $500. That's the first month's rent. So that's $1,000. In Nigeria, they want sometimes 2 years rent in advance. So if it's $500 a month, that's $6,000 a year times 2 years, that's $12,000. So when we got to Nigeria and we started looking for a house, we were staying with, there was a Nigerian that had a house, and we stayed in his house free. He said, while you're looking for your house, you can stay here. So we had a month while we looked, and we realized we don't have the money for this. There was no money. I had only set aside $500. Well, I had $1,000 set aside because I was thinking, okay, it's going to cost us, just a couple of $100, like $300 a month. I was thinking, okay, $600 is what I was going to need, and then I'd have $400 to buy furniture and do whatever, because we didn't have mattress. We didn't ship anything to Africa, just our luggage. So I finally found a realtor. I found a house. Went to negotiate with the landlord, and I had $1,000 in an envelope. And I learned that children know how to pray. They have sometimes greater faith than we do. And so my oldest son, Matthew, led us in prayer. And, and I said, I would like to get the house. I can't afford paying more than $500 a month with the deposit of $500 and a month's, I was going to try and negotiate that. So I only had $1,000. So we set up an appointment with the owner of the house. And Matthew, I had a little briefcase with $1,000 inside that briefcase. And Matthew, just before I got into the taxi, Matthew prayed and asked God to give us the house for $500. So we would be able to keep $500 to buy mattresses and whatever else we needed. So we prayed. I went to the bathroom, came out, got the briefcase, went to the taxi, went to meet the landlord. when I went to meet the landlord, I left the money in the taxi with my briefcase. Negotiated with the landlord, and he agreed $500. That's all he wanted from me. I went back to the taxi. I got in the taxi. I took out the envelope, and there was only $500 in it. 500 was gone. Was missing. I was angry at first, but then the Holy Spirit, I paid the landlord. The Holy Spirit kind of rebuked me and said, "Why are you angry? Your son prayed $500. You had $500. You got the house for $500. Why are you angry?" And so I began to rejoice. I didn't know what happened to the $500, but I paid the rent. And when I got back, Matthew was standing there, and he saw me smiling, and he walked up to me and he said, "You got the house for $500. And I said, "Yes." And he reached in his back pocket and he took out $500. And he said, "I knew if I let you have all of it, you would have spent all of it." And so, but the key to the story is that $500, that was not 1 month. The landlord, because we were going to be doing some things in the house, putting in electricity, because there was no electricity in the house. We were going to put in the water, the water tanks. Because I was going to be doing that over the course of the year, the landlord agreed that I only had to pay $500 for the entire year. So I rented the first house we rented. We rented for $500, and it had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, an office, and a garage. And I got that for $500 for 1 whole year. And so that's how God took care of us. That's where that the blessing of realizing that God, now I tell missionaries, raise all the money you can because you're going to need it. But when in our situation, we learned that God will take care of you even though it seems impossible. And people were amazed. It's like, well, how could you get a house for $500 for the year? And it was not a dumpy house. It was a nice house. We can only say it was God. And God took care of us.
And then, how old were your children when you moved there?
Oh, Matthew, I think, was 9 years old. I'm sorry, 9 years old. Matthew was 9, and John was 1.5, 2 years old. So John we call the bush baby. He was the youngest one. He was more African than he was American. It was hard to teach him to wear shoes because shoes, not long pants, wearing shorts all the time because it was hot. But it actually is a benefit for children to go when they're young because they learn the culture. It's much easier for them to learn the culture. They can learn a language quicker. They adapt quicker. And of course, our children were American, and we knew they were going to be coming back to America. So you can't let them become all African. They are an American. They're going to be in an American school someday. So, we did homeschooling. We had our own home school. And so, there were requirements. We were taught, how to have a home school in Africa. Literally, the children had to walk out one door of our house like they were going to school. They walked out the back door. And then mom and dad switched from being mom and dad to being teachers. And so when the kids came in, we were not mom and dad. We were Mr. Sigstad, Mrs. Sigstad, the teachers. So there was a difference in how they had to behave in school because when they came back, we wanted them to be able to fit in to a normal school situation here in America. And an older missionary had taught me that. Dr. Maurice Paulson had taught me to do that, and that worked very well for us.
Okay. And then, can you tell me how you got saved?
I didn't get saved until after I got married, and I started going to church because I wanted to date Linda Frazier. But Linda would not date me unless I was going to church. Now, at the time, Linda was not a soul winner. she didn't know she was saved, but she wasn't a soul winner. Linda got saved in Bible camp, and so she was saved, but she didn't, and she understood that she ought to be marrying a Christian and so forth. And back when this was in the early 70s, the word saved or born again was not used by churches. Baptist churches, they use the word Christian. And so when I met Linda, she was like, I can't date you unless you're going to church with me. And I said, that's fine. She said, are you a Christian? So she asked me if I was a Christian. Well, in my thinking, I was a Christian. I was lost, but I thought, okay, well, I'm an American. We're a Christian nation. I am a Christian. So I dated her. We got married. And even though I was going to a Baptist church that was a fundamental soul-winning Baptist church, again, the pastor, when I came to the church, he asked me, are you a Christian? And I said, yes. Now, he didn't pursue it. He never asked me just what you asked me. How did you become a Christian? When did you get saved? He never asked that. It was just accepted that I was a Christian. And then Linda's asked me one Sunday, she said, well, have you been baptized? And I answered her, I had been baptized as a baby, so I said, well, I've not been baptized like your church does it. In other words, I was sprinkled as a baby in an Episcopal church. So I went forward. She said, well, you ought to be baptized like, by immersion. So I said, fine, no problem. So I went forward. Pastor said, Mark, are you a Christian? Yes. You want to be baptized? Yes. So he baptized me. And that was fine for, a couple of years. And I was involved in the church. I have a natural ability. I can teach. I can write Bible lessons. And so I did all of that in church. But then our church changed pastors in 1974, in August. We got a new pastor. His name was Ron Royalty. And Brother Royalty came and began teaching and preaching, and God softened my heart. And I realized I am not saved. And I struggled with how can I get saved, because these people think I'm a Christian. I have told them I'm a Christian. I was the superintendent of Sunday schools. I taught the adult Bible class. I was the youth pastor. I had my hands in everything, and the devil was saying, you're going to be embarrassed if you tell them you're not saved. And so I basically okay, I can get saved in the pew. But then the Holy Spirit said, well, if you get saved in the pew, because I didn't want to go forward. And the devil was saying, well, you can get saved here if you want. And the Holy Spirit saying, well, if you get saved here, then what are you supposed to do? Obedience, you got to get baptized, and you're not. So there was a struggle. But in January 19th, 1975, I just, the Holy Spirit said, make a choice. And I realized that if I don't get saved, I'm going to die and go to hell. And so that Sunday, I called my pastor. I talked with him a Sunday afternoon, and I got saved Sunday afternoon. And that Sunday night, I was baptized. But it was a struggle, and there was no big. Because I'd already been in church, because my life had actually conformed to what a Baptist, I didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't run around. I was a pretty good guy in my own eyes, but I was lost. So there wasn't a huge change outwardly when I got saved, but there was a huge change inside. There was the joy there. I used to be angry, but not anymore. And so, and I got baptized, and then, I started, my life changed totally because of the Word of God. But my salvation was not, one day I was lost and the next day I was saved, and, I gave up all this stuff. Literally, I had, because of Linda, I had joined the church, and I literally, started living like a Christian, but I wasn't one. And I thank God for Ron Royalty, who preached the gospel, was faithful, and had patience with me. And that night that I got saved, the song we sing, "Burdens are lifted at Calvary," and we were living the American dream. We were happy. We were in our good church. We were doing things. But as a lost person, I believe there are lost people in churches today who, because of one circumstance or another, they kind of get trapped. They started going to a church, they liked it, but then they'd never really made a decision to trust Christ. And for me, I got along basically, was fine in church, never was pressured. And the only thing is I felt guilty because I got the point where, I'd go to church on Sunday and I had one set of friends in church, but then on Monday through Saturday, I had a totally different set of friends because they were worldly. And though I didn't smoke and drink, I ran with the crowd that did. And my greatest fear was, I would go soul winning on Saturday. My greatest fear was I was going to knock on the door of one of my friends. And they were going to look at me and say, you are the biggest hypocrite on the face of the earth. Because on Sunday, I was like a Christian, but I wasn't. And Monday through Saturday, I lived, I was a worldly person. And my salvation came about because of prayers of Linda and the prayers of good people who could sense that everything wasn't right in my life. And I'm thankful for that they prayed.
And then can you tell me about your family, kids and grandkids, and where they live?
Okay, we have 6 children. All right, Matt, Josh, Daniel, Andrew, Philip, and John. Of course, you know that you're related. All right, they're all married. Our oldest son Matthew is, oh my goodness, he's the oldest one now, and he is 46 years old. And John is in his 30s. So we've got 6 sons, 6 great daughters-in-law, and then we have 12 grandchildren. And our kids are kind of scattered around. 4 of our boys were in the Air Force. 2 have retired from the Air Force. 2 are still in the Air Force, and 2 are in this area. So Matthew lives in Washington, D.C. He's still in the Air Force, and he's going for 30 years. He's like 4 years away from that. Josh lives in Maryville with his family. Daniel and his wife and family live in Oklahoma, and Daniel was in the Air Force, and he's retired now after 20 years, and he works for the Boeing Corporation. He's actually in charge of working on the new Air Force Ones. Last I heard, they were painting them. Then Andrew retired from the Air Force, and he now works for the State Department. After 20 years working with electrical things and generators and internet technology stuff, he now is working for the State Department, and he is based in London, and he travels to embassies in Africa, fixing their generators and working on their electronic stuff. So he and his wife love that. They live in London. Then Philip and his wife and family live in down by St. Louis. They're just across the border in Illinois from St. Louis. And Philip is still in the Air Force. He's got over 20 years in now. And then John lives here in Northwest Indiana, and he is happy and working hard. So that's my 6 kids, and then our grandkids. We have 12 grandkids. It's so funny because it's an even number. Matthews has 2. Joshua has 4? Daniel has none. Daniel has 2. Andrew has none. Philip has 2, and John has 2. So everybody's got 2 except for for Josh, and he makes up for Andy and Lori because Lori can't have kids. So we have 12 grandkids.
And then, how did you meet Linda?
Well, Linda, we met kind of unique. My older brother married Linda's older sister, and that's how we met. My older brother was dating Ruth Frazier, and I took him one weekend. He needed a ride out to where Ruth lived. My brother was in the military, and he was working in Minneapolis. Ruth was a telephone operator in Minneapolis, and she was coming to southern Minnesota every weekend. And so one weekend, my brother came down, and he didn't have a car, and so he said, "Can you take me out to Ruth's house where her parents live?" And I said, "Sure." And so I drove him to the house, and when I pulled in the driveway, Linda was outside pulling an engine on a 67 Chevy. and I told my brother, because she had grease from her fingertips to her elbows, and I told my brother, I said, if I ever get married, that is not the kind of woman I want, and that's the one that God gave me.
And then, can you tell me about your tough times going?
Well, there's a lot of tough times. There's tough times as far as, and tough is relative term. I look back today and I say, well, they weren't so tough. But tough times can be tough. There are times that are tough financially when you don't get the support that comes in. There are tough times physically. There are tough times mentally, tough times spiritually when things don't go well in the church. I guess probably one of the most difficult times for Linda and me was when our son John, of course he's the baby, and John came down with typhoid fever. And his temperature went very high, and we had to put him in a hospital. And it's an African hospital, and it's very, very difficult because when you go to the hospital in Africa, it's like if you had to go in for surgery. The doctor will sit you down, and he will take a piece of paper like this, and he will sit down, and he will take a pen, and he will write out everything he's going to need in surgery. Let's say you're going to have your tonsils taken, and he will say, okay, I'm going to need gauze pads. I'm going to need scalpel blades. I'm going to need sutures. And he will give you that list and say, now you need to go out and buy all of this stuff and bring it to me. And once we get everything here, then we will do the surgery. Well, John, again, he's a child. And we took him to the hospital because his temperature was so high. Doctor wasn't sure what it was, but they ended up, it was typhoid fever. And they, chloramphenicol is the drug that they needed to treat typhoid fever. The problem is they had the chloramphenicol, John was there, but they didn't have a needle small enough for a child to be able to inject that drug into his vein. And that was tough for us. And he was in the hospital on a Saturday. He went in Saturday night. Was in the hospital all Saturday night, all day Sunday. And of course, Sunday we had church services. Linda stayed at the hospital. I preached, had our church people praying. Because one of the things you learn in Africa is prayer makes a difference. And on Monday morning, I went to the hospital. And as I was walking to the hospital, the doctor met me outside the hospital. And he, I stuck my hand out to shake his hand. And he said, Pastor Mark, today's the day I want you to take John home. And I was shocked. I said, wow, has he gotten better overnight? And the doctor said, no, today is the day he will die. We can't help him. And he said, I cannot have a child like your child die in my hospital. Because if I can't save a child of a white person who has the money for the drugs and the good care, people will lose confidence in me. They will say, I can't save a black child either. And that probably was one of the lowest times, the most discouraging and difficult times. And it's not like we could text somebody. It's, this was back in the day when, there's no phone calls. I mean, I was going to have to go downtown. I didn't have a car, going to have to rent a taxi, go downtown, make a phone call. But the phone call was not going to be come and help me. The phone call was basically just to tell people, contact the mission and say, I need people to pray, but I can't call my supporting churches. You have to call. And the only person I called the mission, the only person I called other than the mission was the man who led me to the Lord. I called Ron Royalty. And I said, I need you to pray. And I got people to pray. And then through a set of circumstances, the Southern Baptists had a big hospital run by American doctors about 2.5, 3 hours north of where we were. And I knew the executive director of the Southern Baptist Mission. And he was a friend of mine. And he sent a car. And he said, we're going to take your son and we're going to take him to our hospital, to the Southern Baptist Hospital in Beaumont. And we got him to that hospital, but John was already hemorrhaging inside. And we got there, and the doctors basically said, we can do nothing. Can't do anything other than pray. and we basically did a 24-hour round-the-clock prayer, and there was a doctor, a medical doctor came into that room every half hour and prayed with us every half hour. And after 24 hours, John was fine. I mean, he wasn't fine. He had stopped hemorrhaging, and 2 days later, he was hungry. But that was one of those times, and it was a learning time for us. It was a tough time, but it was a learning time. You know, I learned, okay, I need to have needles. I got to buy needles in America when I travel and bring them with me because, I've got children, and I need the small needles, so if they get sick, I can have a doctor inject them with the needles that are. So we learned. But that was a tough time for us. It was a very difficult, week where, we're not sleeping. There's a lot of prayer and discouragement. Now I've been beaten. We've been robbed several times. We have had people, try to harm us. So there's a lot of tough times. But, through it all, when you look back, you see how God is taking care of you. And so, and John. I mean, John's a horse today. I mean, big guy, and he's done well. But at that time, it was a scary time. It was tough for us.
And then I heard something about one of those robber stories. Something happened to one of your children.
Oh, well, the thing is, one of the very first times we were robbed. In fact, it may have been the very first time we were robbed. They came into our house and they knocked on the door and we answered it, and the guy had a newspaper. He literally had a newspaper folded under his arm like this, like he was carrying a newspaper, but he had his hand inside that newspaper. And so when I opened the door, and again, I'm a pastor, somebody comes and knocks on your door, you open the door. And so I opened the door and he pulled out a gun, and Linda was there. And he told me to, take him, he wanted my money because he figured we would have a lot of money. He took Linda's necklace. He took our glasses so we couldn't see him. Linda had glasses, I had glasses. He took our rings, and I no longer wear a wedding ring. I'm still married. I've had like 4 wedding bands stolen from me. But John, again, the youngest one. And so when they came into the house, there were 2 men. And to motivate us, they took John and put a gun to his head and said if we did not do what they asked, they would shoot John. So those are that well, you could call that a tough time too. but John's still here, and even in the tough times. Now the next question I know you're going to ask a blessing. All right, the blessings of the ministry. Well, see, even in the tough times, okay, I've told you about the like the rent. That's a blessing. Even in the tough times, John is still here because though it was a tough time, God intervened on his behalf. There are so many things that God has done for us. And today when people say, give us, tell us, if they were to ask me, what is your biggest blessing? I think the biggest blessing is the people. When you win somebody to the Lord, and I mean, they get saved, and they, you watch them grow in the Lord. And now we've been married. We've been in the ministry. We were missionaries for 35 years. And there are people that we can point to who got saved in that first year and are still in church, are still, and now we've got another generation. The first husband and wife, the first man and woman that I did their wedding in our church, Dapo and Josephine Adabihi, and Dapo and Josephine. And, we did that wedding, Dapo and Josephine. I mean, they stayed in our church. They raised their family in our church on their 25th wedding anniversary. We had a special service in the church for them, and I did the wedding ceremony for one of their children, and the young man, and his wife. And to me, that's the blessing, is seeing the people's lives changed. And it may be tough sometimes, but when you dwell on the fact that, okay, lives are being changed and people are being changed. And to me, that's the biggest blessing in the ministry today. And looking at our national pastors and saying, okay, we've started churches, and though I'm not on the field now, in the sense of a church planting missionary on the field. The churches are still going strong because the national pastors, the guys that we won to the Lord, that we trained, one of our churches, Pastor G. De Popola, they just celebrated the 30th anniversary of their church. And Pastor G. Day was one of the men who came to our church and got saved in our church, and he never went to Bible college. His entire training was he was in our service. I mean, once he got saved, every service, Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and he's just a student of the Bible. And he, his Bible college, he will tell you, I got my Bible college listening to Pastor Mark preach and teach the Word of God. And so then to me, that's a blessing.
And then what are you currently doing now?
Okay, we're not retired. In 2016, now my wife Linda, and Aunt Linda, she has Parkinson's disease, and I'm suffering just from old age. I have what's called COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. I can't get a good breath, and there's nothing they can do to fix that. I've lost about 40% of capacity of my lungs. So I'm limited. I can no longer run the 100-meter dash. I can't do marathons on that. So BIMI has a ministry that they call the ARM ministry. So we're still missionaries with BIMI. And the ARM ministry is the Assistant and Relief Missionary. And what we do, and I've got a piece of paper I'm going to give you. I have it here, or you have it over there. Basically, what BIMI does with missionaries like myself, we, with our pastor, formulate a plan of what we can do to continue our ministry. So my ministry, Linda and my ministry, what we do is while we're in America, we do missions conferences. I preach in churches. I teach in Bible colleges. I write Bible curriculum. I do a lot of things here in America. I'm preaching almost every week. The weeks I'm not preaching, I'm in my home church, obviously. Then 4 times a year, on average, I travel to Africa, spend about a month each time. And what I do when I'm there is I work with our local churches, our national pastors that we've trained. We do pastor training sessions where I'm teaching the pastors. We also do seminars. I go into churches and do revivals. What I do is I get the pastors together and I ask them what are the problems they're dealing with. How can I help your church while I'm here? And so I will teach different topics. Also, when I'm in Africa, I have a pretty good sized prison ministry. So I preach in prisons. I teach in universities. So when I go, to Africa, I'm still in Africa, and what I'm doing is I'm edifying. In fact, this little piece of paper, I always do these fancy little things. The 4 things I've got is what I call evangelize the lost. All right, that's still soul winning. So evangelize the lost, encourage the local church and the pastor, both here and there, enlist another generation of servants. In other words, trying to get another generation, both here and there. The hope for Africa is not in the white missionary. The hope for Africa is the African doing what we're doing. In other words, the national pastors leading African people. And then the last thing is educating the next generation. I write Bible correspondence courses. I write curriculum for Bible schools. So I'm actually almost, I want to say, busier than I used to be. But it's a lot of office work. But I still go out and soul win and do all the things that I used to do. I'm just not starting brand new churches at this point.
And then I think that's all the questions.
That's all the questions. You have it a lot, and I'm glad.
And then is it okay if you would explain all the stuff that you brought? Like explain what they are.
Oh, okay. I've got for your display. All right. Now she's got a display, so I'm going to talk to the camera. She's got a display, and we've got some things. I'm going to move here and just get them, and we'll put them up here, and you can see one of the things that we've got here. All right. I preached in a village, and they had a wood carver, and my emphasis, I don't know if you can see this, but it's okay. The emphasis, he carved a figure, and he's holding a book, and because I preach the Bible, he said, this is you holding up the Word of God. Because I always tell them it's not the missionary, it's the Word of God that's going to make a difference in their life. This little thing here, all these, this little purse is actually made. We have, as I said, we've got a large prison ministry, and in Ghana, one of the things that we're doing is helping the inmates. They're starting projects, and they're teaching them how to make purses, and this actually is made of bamboo and cloth, and this handmade and then the beads. We have this purse here. This is a little purse of Africa. It's made with the light brown leather is camel, and then there's a lizard skin on that. That's just something that they do. Of course, we have the stone elephant. All right, this is all going to be on the display. We have fans. This is African air conditioning, and this is made in the prison also. And again, it's bamboo. Basically, when you watch them do this, they put the little screw in there. They put the pieces of bamboo, and then what they do is with it sitting on the table, they put a little glue on each one of the bamboo pieces, and then put the cloth on it. And I've been in the prison when they do all that. One of the things, various religions. This here, all right. This here is an Islamic prayer rug. All right, you're going to have that on your table. All right, that's made. I think this is made in. It's imported. It's made in Turkey, but these are used in the prayer time. And then I've got a wood carving of Africa. All right, and then we also have. A lot of wood carving, heavy stuff. This is a representation of a Yoruba couple, and that's solid. That's ebony wood, what they call ebony. Another fan, different color. And then the last thing we've got in Ghana, there is the word that you see right there. A-K-W-A-A-B-A, Akwaba. When you land in the airport, this word is inside the airport, and it's a Ghanaian word that means you are welcome. Now, it's not like when someone sneezes and you say God bless you and you say you're welcome. It's a word that means you are welcome to our country or to our church or whatever, and you will be treated as family. And so in our churches in Ghana, we actually put this above the pulpit. So when people come in the door, they see that word. And this is actually kente cloth, which is native to Ghana. This is all handmade with a loom. And this is just a carrying bag that's handmade in Ghana also. All right? And you should have a good display. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We appreciate you so much.
And that's it.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.